Welcome back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast summer editions. I'm calling this Part-2-Palooza. We'll be picking up where we left off with the second halves to the second half of Season 2 episodes of the show. First up is the continuation of my conversation with Rolando Pujol, the Retrologist, who talked to me about Howard Johnson's and Holiday Inn. If you'd like to go back and brush up, Part 1 came out on December 15th, 2022. Now, just like other aspects of Roadside Americana, after recording this episode with Rolando, I kept noticing references to Hojo's and Holiday Inn here and there. For instance, I recorded an episode for another podcast about, surprisingly, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and while doing show prep was reminded that their very first issue was the highlight of the mini-con held at Howard Johnson's Motor Lodge on the Portsmouth Traffic Circle here in New Hampshire. A few months later, I hosted a podcast karaoke at a diner on that traffic circle, which happens to be right next door to a Holiday Inn and around the corner from the same Hojo's. Then, while I was enjoying the Sun Records-centered $1 Million Quartet jukebox musical this spring, narrator Sam Phillips mentions that he just got in on the ground floor of a new motel chain from Memphis called Holiday Inn, evoking an ironic chuckle from the audience. This is not only absolutely true, Phillips became so involved in the chain that he even ran the Holiday Inn record label after his friend and the Hotel Line's founder, Kemmons Wilson, left the record company to pursue other interests. And that's just a small example of what discussing interesting topics can do. Anyhow, on to part 2. The appearance of the architecture and the cosmetics of those buildings kind of inspired or at least piqued your interest at a young age, and you said, wow, that's unique, and it kind of crossed between the lines. When I was talking earlier with the gentleman from a Christmas Story House, we were talking about how that post World War II urban renewal movement of like out with the old, in with the new, really kind of took over the country. And I gotta say that there's nobody I could look at, especially Howard Johnson's, and be like, yeah, that's old. I mean, it looks almost cartoonish. It's straight from the 50s, the post World War II era, at least. It's so like outlandish.
It's so outlandish, but and it's funny. I mean, it was something that was designed to attract attention. And it did. And it was designed to, there was a lot of research that went into that. I think Howard Johnson was very careful in everything that he did, very strategic. And, it connotes for people, for those who grew up with it, or in the shadow of that era. Because, I grew up I was born in the 70s. So I caught the tail end of Hojo still being Hojo's before the company got sold multiple times and broken up, and the hotels got separated from the restaurants, and it gets really complicated from there. But there was great meaning in that for people. But then at the same time, if a company does not find a way to refresh the brand while still being true to its roots, understanding where it came from, what made it a success, but also adapting to what's coming and to changing tastes, it's going to run into trouble. Yeah. And that's kind of the pickle that Howard Johnson found itself in the early and mid 80s, when their restaurants were looking pretty dated. They were really seen, and not in a favorable way, as a throwback to the 50s and 60s and maybe even 40s. There were some locations that hadn't been touched in many decades. Yeah. And the whole world around them was changing. They had experimented with different styles. For example, in 1965, there was the famous Concept 65, which was famously rolled out in Plattsburgh. That was like the one that you probably visited back in the day. That's the one that Don Draper visits, right? The one that sort of fused the gatehouse from the motor lodges and sort of rammed it into the restaurant itself. So they were experimenting with things. Certainly, they even experimented with a fast food version of Howard Johnson called Hojo's Junction. And the idea for that was you would go into this Hojo's Junction, which was kind of like, again, that traditional gatehouse gatehouse A-frame style design. Go in, and it was self-service. I mean, you would have food to go, or you could eat it there. There was a dining room, and it was an acknowledgement by Hojo's that, we got to keep an eye on what McDonald's and Burger King and KFC, what these guys are doing. But they never quite got their arms around this whole idea that, we really need to be worried about fast food, because we are not fast food. We're actually developing a reputation for being slow food. So by the 80s, that sort of like that iconic Howard Johnson signage and certainly the restaurant design, the motel lodge design, is starting to feel a little bit dated, and they didn't really, stay with the times. I mean, it is interesting that Howard Deering Johnson, had he lived, had he not died in 1972, he was only 75. He could have got another decade or two.
Right.
I mean, if he had made it longer, I just have a hard time believing that he would have let the company be sold to a British conglomerate and then sort of like have the rapid collapse that it experienced in the 1980s. He would have said, like, what are we doing about this McDonald's? What are we doing about Burger King? People are changing their tastes. Our restaurants are getting old. We're compromising on food quality. What, are you crazy? You can't do this. None other than the great French chef Jacques Pepin, who with Pierre Fernet worked for Howard Johnson at his famous commissary here in Queens, not far from where I live, and really elevated the quality of food at the insistence of Howard Johnson, who would like show up at the test kitchens and really had a great command for every aspect of the operation and the quality that it had to maintain. Pepin, in his autobiography, talks about how the son, Howard Brennan Johnson, just didn't get it. The company, with the loss of Howard Deering Johnson, the dad, the company lost its reason for being. And the son was more focused on, knew his way better around a spreadsheet and all of his Ivy League educated cohorts than they did a kitchen, than they did the dining room. And that this in and of itself, in addition to the changing America around it, was the seed of the chain's destruction. They just had they been less focused on managing costs and maintaining an annual profit, which became the overriding focus after Hojo's went public in 1961, which was another moment that would eventually create tension and troubles. Once you're public, you've got to start managing your costs in a different way, right? It basically, everything that we look back now with such nostalgia and warmth for the old Hojos, by the 80s, it just looked really tired.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the same thing that Holiday Inn was doing when its motor lodges, which dated way back to the first one in Memphis in 1952, they were getting tired as well. They even had this famous print ad, which I could send you the link for your show notes, that shows, the brand new Hojo sign for the 1980s. And it shows a tiny version of the great sign and says, we're moving away from this. It's a new Hojo's Holiday Inn for the 80s. So both brands were dealing with these problems in sort of different ways. But Holiday Inn seems to have survived the transition a little bit better. Hojo's just collapsed. The restaurants have all gone away. The very last one that was a shadow, it wasn't really a Howard Johnson. It was just a Howard Johnson in name, closed earlier this year in Lake George, one that I visited 3 times. And then and of course the hotel survived as part of the Wyndham empire. But if you go to Wyndham's website and look for Howard Johnson's, the Howard Johnson logo is one of many little brands, and it's sort of like toward the middle of the pack. I mean, it's really sad.
It is
that it all came to that. And it didn't necessarily have to. Like, one of the things that I get really frustrated about, which you will read if you go through my Instagram account. I mean, I'm constantly giving McDonald's a hard time for knocking down their old buildings and putting up the McBoxes and getting rid of the Hamburglar and McDonald Land. But yet there is really smart strategy behind that, because they have found a way to remain relevant. They haven't allowed themselves to fall into the trap of not changing for fear of alienating their core audience. They have managed to keep the brand fresh. I think they've gone too far in the direction away from nostalgia and heritage. And we've seen a couple of things this year that have brought them back to that, like the retro Happy Meals, for example, the return of
the
Halloween
pumpkins,
meals, right? The punk, exactly, which I have a couple in my kitchen I could show you, but they have managed to stay fresh. There was good management, and they were able to correct when they were starting to get soft and when they were starting to get stuck, and people were starting to say, "Yeah, McDonald's is old and tired." They did innovate. So I don't give them nearly enough credit on my Instagram for that, but then that's also not a very popular opinion.
Right.
Everybody wants McDonald's of their child.
I'm kind of wondering if the reason why Holiday Inn was able to, I guess, considering that they arrived when they did, when, I realized Howard Johnson's was still going strong in the early 50s, but that overlap, it's almost like the trajectory that Holiday Inn took there. It's almost, you could break it down almost just the symbols alone and even the font. Like Holiday Inn, if you keep it uniform letter size and then add a little express, nice, like simple, sleek looking express at the end, it doesn't seem as dated.
Mm-hmm.
But even, the last few Howard Johnsons that exist, they try to do that. The sign says Howard Johnson's in just a little, kind of like subtle, understated way, but it's still like, yeah, and you have a giant orange roof. It's like, it's not, and the Simple Simon and the pie, Pie Man, and then, that couldn't look any more early 20th century. That silhouette.
No.
It doesn't carry over well. It's not like, the RCA dog, which you can kind of, when you look at the early versions of what do you call it, the Victrola, with the dogs there, it's very turn of the century, it's very 19th, early 20th, but then they really bring it up to date, they keep it modern, but you can't do that with and so when they introduced the lamplighter figure, I don't think it was the same artist that created both, right? It's a new, and he's trying to match.
I don't believe so. Merging him into that
family, merging him into the family, and it's like, yeah, I know what you're doing. It's for consistency purposes, but it kind of reminds me of, like, I think the few times that I went to Howard Johnson, seeing those symbols and just being like, I feel like this place is behind in the times. It's not. This isn't 80s, 90s, type place. It's, if it was presented as nostalgia, then I think it would have done better, but it wasn't being presented that way. It was being presented as, this is
and you've hit
we're
a very
competing with other ones.
Because, no, you're absolutely, I know, spot on that, because the franchise restaurants, when Imperial Group, the British concern, sold Hojo's to Marriott back in the mid 80s, 1985, 1986, Marriott kept the restaurants that were owned by Howard Johnson's and converted most of them to Bob's Big Boy or Roy Rogers or things like that. Sold some of them as well. The franchise restaurants and the motor lodges went with another company called Prime Motor Inns, and they ended up eventually spinning off the franchise restaurants into a different organization called the Franchise Associates, which were basically the owners of the franchised Howard Johnson's restaurants, which were close to 200 at the time in 1986. They were feeling that their needs were not being properly represented. On the one hand, they've been divorced from the corporate stores, and Marriott's turning those into Bob's Big Boy, and Prime Motor Inn is more focused on hotels anyway. So they were afraid they were going to get shut down or orphaned, or in fact, I even found an article that they were being kind of forced. There was talk of them turning into Bob's Big Boys, and they were going to have to pay for the privilege. So they fought back, threatened litigation. They even hired Griffin Bell, who was the former attorney general under Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. And they were able to basically receive the intellectual property for Howard Johnson as it's connected to restaurants and foods, the frozen food business. That was also, they had a line of food in supermarkets. And they were able to keep the restaurants as they were and do as they pretty much pleased with them. They maintained a commissary system for a while. They swore up and down they were going to invest in the properties and market them better and improve the actual infrastructure. But all of that required money.
Right.
And the money wasn't there. And so even the Howard Johnson franchised restaurants, which numbered over 100 in the mid-'80s, gradually went away, the same way that the corporate-owned ones that Marriott was turning into Bob's Big Boy or spilling off, those went away. So that we got to this situation in the last decade where we were finally down to just 3 locations, Bangor, Maine, Lake Placid, New York, and then Lake George. And finally, Lake George sort of died with a whimper earlier this year. And I did not mourn it. I mean, I had visited Lake George 3 times. In 2008, when it still had the feel of an old Howard Johnson's, 2015, after it had reopened after a period of being closed under different ownership, and it was definitely on the decline. And then I visited in 2019 one more time against my better judgment, and it was grim. It was really grim. And it was that feeling you get when, I mean, this is really hurtful, but it's time for this to die, I mean, and so
I'm pretty familiar with Lake George. The Howard Johnson's, was it like kind of like near the top of the strip before you start hitting like the actual lakefront area, or was it closer to?
It was way up there,
Glens Falls.
and it still had the portion of the orange room.
Yeah,
and it used to have a Howard Johnson's motor lodge up as well. So
that's right. Okay, that's because I was a frequent visitor of the Great Escape. Growing up, we would go there all the time, and that is another layered history behind that particular amusement park. It started out as Story Town USA, and for the exact same purposes. They had that because Lake George is not terribly far from New York City. You could get people up there for weekend trips all the time, and it's it's even beyond Saratoga. And you had that kind of matriculate into it, and it reminds me a lot because you have, like, to me, Lake George is always like that. It's a very historic place. It has history that goes all the way back 18th century, but it almost had like a plasticky feel to it of very early 20th century. Like they had the fort there, Fort William Henry, excuse me, where it's from French and Indian War, and they have reenactments there like you would expect, but it right at the base of it is like arcades and t-shirt shops, and that's where you get on the boats to go on
Frankenstein's wax museum,
right? It's like and it's like, oh yeah, it's almost like, well, there's the haunted house, there's our old colonial fort, and there's like it just like this paradise of. And you don't have to go that far. And there's Frontierland is nearby, but it's not New York State Frontierland. It's like New Mexico Frontierland, but it's in New York. It was just like a vacation land. That whole corridor north of Albany, is just vacation land off the Northway. The very same road that eventually goes all the way up to Plattsburgh.
Yeah,
and it's just, what better setting for a Howard Johnson's that lasts and just holds on, because I think when people still go to Lake George now, it's for that nostalgia purpose. They see that as their old stomping grounds from when either
that's right. It's
a fun.
It's to get that shop worn 1950s, 60s. It's fun.
IHOP has.
So it's funny that's where Howard Johnson's final stand ended.
Right, this last stand, and it's not terribly far from.
Oh, IHOP too. IHOP
number one. And that's another business that even just the architecture reminds me a lot of the Hojos, the steep, big cathedral, steep roofs and everything. And that was a pretty standard. We would travel a lot as a kid. My dad was in the Air Force, so we moved around, not as much as some of our friends did and stuff, but enough that we'd have to travel to go see parents, go see in-laws and family and relatives and stuff. And so we got pretty well known, we knew the interstates pretty well and all the different things. And IHOP was like one of those places late at night, kind of,
as our way home or something. Late for me anyway. It was one of those places like, oh, my shoes are off, and I'm getting comfy, and I wake up, hey, we're gonna get something to eat, okay, and go into this cathedral of pancakes. And but they had a
Oh,
lot of that
yeah.
same like 60s holdover stuff. It was the mid 80s, but I'm like, did I go back in time? Like, what is going on here? And it's like
So,
the
and I had
decision
a
that those
recent,
corporations have to
yeah, yeah.
make. Like, are we going to try to cash in? Like, if we hold off long enough and remain looking the same long enough, we'll be able to cash in on nostalgia. But if we try too hard to stay in the old days, then people are going to literally bypass us entirely. They're just like, no, we're not going to deal with
It
you.
is so difficult making those decisions. I mean, I do not envy, the executives in those corporate rooms, who have to make those in those boardrooms, who have to make those decisions about how to evolve the brand while being true to the brand. I mean, recently the easiest thing has been to turn everything into a sleek glass box and update the logo and
Yeah.
make everything feel like a Chipotle. But I think that's sort of been an overreaction. Right now, to put it mildly, right now you could see a Wendy's, a Burger King, and a McDonald's are all lined up right next to each other, and they all look essentially the same. I mean,
Yeah.
there's differentiations in color and emphasis on proportion, but basically, it's the same design. Whereas they're no longer marketing by making the building represent the brand.
Right.
And I think that's a lost opportunity. It would have been so much more interesting if McDonald's had done what they've done in Europe, which is they have updated their restaurants, but they kept a nod to the mansard roof in these
Yeah.
little kind of canopies. And it still looks like a McDonald's, but a freshened up McDonald's.
Right.
It doesn't instinctively annoy
Right.
the way that the box does.
I remember when those started showing up, like around the turn of this century, where it was like, McDonald's
Yeah.
closed for 2 weeks or something, and you see them bringing it in on a truck. They're like, here's your new McDonald's, and it looks like a shoebox, and it's like, oh, I know you're going for it, but it's the same. It happens all the time. University campuses and New York State
Yep.
capital. The entire Albany, used to have such. And it's
Yeah.
the second time today I brought it up, but I mean, the Empire Plaza is perfect example of like early
Empire
50s,
State Plaza.
60s, like let's make this, we're gonna have a space age, it's gonna look like a spaceship landed right next to the Capitol, and it's like you have this gorgeous Capitol building,
The egg,
and it's the egg, and you're like, why do you have an egg? It's and then like this grass is poking up through the cement, and it's just like, oh, come on, like, couldn't you just leave it a little bit? We couldn't have that, and it is, you put it so well. It's like
Nelson Rockefeller's great vision. So
right, he could have kept it, but with Holiday Inn, I think it should be mentioned its connection to classic film, because I wonder if that has any factor at all to the way it has survived. Whereas, and obviously, having a name of a person as your title of your brand isn't necessarily a recipe for good or bad. It could go either way. I mean, McDonald's has lasted forever, and that's an actual family name from New Hampshire originally.
That's right.
And
that's right.
That's actually funny. A few years ago, we use Atlas Obscura obsessively. I'm sure you're familiar with Atlas Obscura.
Oh, it's a fun site. Yeah, it's one of those things that I'm like, why didn't I invent that myself? Anyway,
right, exactly. Well, your Instagram is like a companion to it. It's like a lot of the same kinds of ideas. And we went and visited.
Buy me out.
I think it was Mac McDonald's grave site. Well, it's actually it's in a what do you call it? Not sarcophagus, but what a big building that has all the a mausoleum. Yeah, thank you. And the mausoleums in Goffstown, New Hampshire, and it's not hard to find them because there's the McDonald's arch on his headstone. It's awesome. Like, so it's like branding even.
I think Kevin Wilson's has the great sign on his.
I wouldn't be surprised. So obviously the Howard Johnson's name isn't a curse, but it's also not a virtue. But I think with Holiday Inn, it's so
Right.
funny because, as it's being built, at least as legend goes, the builder, the surveyor, whatever, architects, kind of jokingly refer to it as Holiday Inn based on the Fred Astaire Bing Crosby movie. And they're like, yeah,
Yep.
let's stick with that. So it's like, if you ever stay at a Holiday Inn,
Let's stick with it.
you are by extension, getting some kind of interaction with Hollywood. It's like, it's a funny, you
That's right.
know, kind of deal there, just kind of just demonstrating how the many layers or the cycle of pop culture, that it just, this movie was popular enough, and in those days they really,
Yeah.
musicals were the thing, because that's how allowed
Sure.
for a movie to endure. And White Christmas comes from that movie, so and Easter Parade, and all that whole thing. And then it ends up being the name of a hotel chain, and a very successful one at that. And so when people see like the, in an old movie store, which don't exist anymore, but if they were to see like, oh, Holiday Inn, haha, like the hotel, it's like, actually other way around. The hotel is by extension,
It's the other way.
you know from
Absolutely.
this. And I think with a name like that, it it lends itself, branding wise and longevity wise, to being able to adjust a little bit more with the times. It has that,
It
because
was a
I always,
little bit
and
more open.
yeah,
Correct.
and because I
Yeah.
always associated, until I learned that it was directly tied to the movie the same name, I kind of just saw it as like the English version of vacation, holiday, going on holiday. So when you're on
Mhm.
holiday, you stay at this inn. But then when I found out there's actually the movie that inspired the name, I'm like, oh, okay, well, it still works. But however it works, as
Absolutely.
long as it's filling
Yeah.
rooms, they don't care, whatever gets people there. Um,
Absolutely. Oh,
so
by the way, you had mentioned earlier that famous quote about being on the highways and you never seeing
yeah.
anything. So I did a quick research while we were chatting, and I found this link on the Department of Transportation. Actually, they have a whole blog here, and the actual quote was first said by John Steinbeck, written by
Oh,
John Steinbeck in his famous book with Charlie in Search of America, which I'm sure you've read, or it's on your list.
yeah.
I've read part of it. It's great. And he goes, when we get these throughways across the whole country, and we must, it will be possible to drive from New York to California without seeing a single thing. Then 30 years later, none other than one of my great inspirations, Charles Kuralt of CBS from On the Road, he makes a similar observation in one of his books. The interstate highway system is a wonderful thing. It makes it possible to go from coast to coast without seeing anything or meeting anybody, which is absolutely
Okay.
true.
So
So
I mixed up Corral and Cronkite. I knew it was a great newsman. It was,
yeah,
and who better to come up with that
exactly.
observation. And it's funny because when we were traveling west last year, we got a really good view of Route 66 from next to Route
Yeah.
66, because I-40 runs
Ooh,
parallel to 66. And it's like, and of course,
I-40.
Route
Yeah,
66 is so
that's right.
integral in the Grapes of Wrath. And it's how the Jodes get from Oklahoma to California. And in that era, in the 30s, there was a brand new highway, and it makes perfect sense. But when roads are created, it's, the road itself is a reflection of the needs of the people of the time. And so when you have the great
That's
wide
right.
expanses of the desert of the West, Route 66 has a very short lifespan. It's really not, it doesn't, it's not long before the country says, no, we need greater roads than that. And it's crazy when you go down Route
That's right.
I-40, and you're like, I remember, I think as soon as we got into, we went over from Texas to New Mexico, we were like, first of all, like, I can't believe I'm in New Mexico right now. This is crazy. That I drove here, by the way. But as we pulled off the first exit, and there are so many ghost towns with the old motels that, no, I mean, I don't
Yes.
know if anybody, we weren't going to hang around some of them to find out if there's like
No, right.
spoilers or something. Creepy, creepy, creepy. There's a few like spots on Route 66 that are preserved kind of as like historic highway, but the vast majority of it, you could technically drive on it, but There's actually a guy from the town I live in here in New Hampshire, in Milton, New Hampshire, that in 2020 did all of Route 66 in a model, not a Model T, but another Ford from the 20s. And, it took him
Marvelous. Oh
twice as
boy.
long, but he did get to meet people along the
Yeah,
way. He was stopping and he even he did the more traditional 66 and he stuck to 66. He didn't hit the interstates. And so, but I'm like, but the rest of us, yeah, you get a really good view of the old roads, kind of like when you're driving the thruway in New York State, you go on I-90,
yeah,
you're right next to the railroad and you're right next to the Erie
that's right.
Canal. It's like these different
Yep.
layers, and each one of them leaves behind their own tavern, hotel, inn.
Yes,
If you were to travel the rails, you would be hitting Harvey houses out west, the Fred Harvey
absolutely. I mean,
companies, which I'm sure Howard
it,
Johnson's
it,
had to have looked at as inspiration.
unquestionably, that was part of his research. And it's funny you should mention that, those adjacent roads, because I mean, even on the Northway up toward you, right along the Northway, you have US 9,
Yeah,
which is where so much of that lovely wonderful kitsch that goes right through Lake George still survives. If
yeah,
you the remnants of Frontier Town, as you were
right.
saying earlier,
Santa's Village
and
and
all of that. Yeah, it's all that good stuff.
and
Yeah, exactly.
it's
So
like and for a while there, I think the Northway, I-89 ended not terribly far north of Saratoga. And
right.
so drivers would up until like the 60s or so would have to get off the
Yeah,
highway and get onto Route 9. That was their only choice to go up further
north,
north.
for sure,
And
north.
no coincidence that those hotels I was mentioning before and the neighborhood that was a Catholic summer school is on Route 9. It's
Yep.
like right there. And, early, I'd say by the 20s or 30s, they were starting to advertise out of those hotels that you could rent a car and even hire a driver to bring you around. And they had like different
Yes.
markers, like, a drive to Lake Placid would be this much and take this amount of
Yep.
time, or up to Montreal, same thing. And then after a while, they were encouraging people to drive their cars. But by that point, people were like, why am I going to go to some old, spend a week in a hotel if I can hit a
Right.
Holiday Inn or a Hojo's and several, go several
That's
different
right.
places and just, go to these
And
franchise
explore
motels.
the country. Get out there on the Great American
Yeah.
Road.
I
Yeah.
mean, I that
Yeah.
was why we did it
It's so
last
funny.
year.
There are so many.
Was that
Oh
reason? So I'm
yeah. I
like,
mean,
I
you
always
did
wanted to
something,
see
a trip very
America. Yeah.
similar to the one that. Yeah. I mean, you did what Kevin Wilson did and had such a horrible experience, that he said, we're going to create a system of motels so that I don't have another horrible experience like this again. It's going to be some really good lodging. And, it's interesting. One of the things that you notice, especially when you get out there on the highways and byways, is how many signs there are out there that were inspired by the Great Sign, where people often assume that those were former great signs that got repurposed. One of the more famous ones is on Route 66, the Munger Moss, which is just spectacular. And it is basically a clone of a great sign, but it was not a great sign. There are many more like that still to this day exist around the country. But if you want to see an actual great sign, there's two places you can go. You can see smaller versions of them, unfortunately, but they do exist at the American Sign Museum in Cincinnati, which if you've never been, I just went and I had a couple of weeks ago, and remarkable place. And then the Henry Ford Museum, of course, in
Okay.
Michigan
They
has another
have,
one as well.
that sounds like a
Yeah, it's
perfect place
just
to
utterly
have
just
one.
spectacular.
They go hand in hand, right?
Oh
Just,
yeah.
autos and
They go hand in
lodging.
hand. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You can't ask for a better, correlation between the two.
That's right.
And I guess
Nope.
what we just did for the last
Nope.
little
Nope.
while is take just a tiny slice, honestly, of American travel and lodging history and hospitality, because those two places came about when they did for that reason, but it's always been there, and I think that especially here in the
Yeah.
East, where I'm in New England and where you are in New York, every single time you see a tavern, you know, like people always, you know, paint them as like, whoa, a tavern was a meeting place where people, it's like, yeah, that's the same thing as what a hotel does now. You know, and I used to work
That's right.
at such a place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it's a 18th century tavern, and you know it was operation, it was in business in the late 18th century. And when people would ask me questions about it, they're like, so what kinds of things did people do here? And as I would describe that, they would, you know, eat, and there would be beds, and they would have
Drink.
newspapers, and you know, you'd get you know, you get your mail here. Oh wow. I'm like, so, and I would usually be in the time period myself, so I couldn't compare it, but when I wasn't in that, you know, attire, I could talk to myself. I'm like,
We get to stay in.
we did. And I was like, so just imagine staying in a hotel. What do you get at a hotel? And then even like a Howard Johnson's or a Holiday Inn, you get a breakfast in the morning, you know, you get your night stay. They usually have the news on TV in the breakfast area, and some places still have, you know, at least for a while, had newspapers at your door, you know, or at least access to one. It was the
Yeah.
exact same thing.
USA Today, baby.
Yeah, exactly. They had that, you know, because they knew that, I mean, it's always been there. It's not anything that was invented. It was just, I guess, adjusted for the changing times of
That's
the
right.
mid 20th century. And it seems like some of them held on and others didn't. But for the ones who didn't, we still have wonderful memories, or at least wonderful photographs and postcards. I always get a kick out of the postcards of motels.
Yes.
You know, like it seems ridiculous
Oh,
now that
oh,
you can't find postcards, first of all, anymore, but when you do, it's usually of like pretty cool
yeah.
stuff, not here's a crappy motel I stayed in, you know, just like, hi, I'm, you know, this is my room right there, you know, that's my little cabin that I was in. But
Yeah, no, but people were proud of that little crappy motel they were in somewhere on some obscure road nobody travels on anymore. But that was a big deal in
yeah,
1952. It was
it
like,
was
hey, Aunt
because
Gladys, look at me. This is
yeah.
where I am. Look at the pool. You know, so
I love coming across at antique stores old postcards, and just like I just
oh,
I can't say no to them, especially if there's, and I think places like I went to a great antique store in Glens Falls a couple years ago, you know,
mm,
right outside Lake George, and they had, of
yep,
course, tons of postcards from that area, but also all over. And I think the vast majority of them have some kind of relationship with a hotel or motel, because they know that that's where you're going to be
absolutely.
writing your postcard most likely. And you know, they could send it out for you in the next day's
Yeah,
post and everything. So even in that era, I can't thank you
our
enough.
best and sometimes only pictures that we have
Yeah, you're right.
are those postcards.
Are
Yeah,
the
exactly.
really
So
nice, you know, well, you know, actual
yep,
photographer. I think my greatest find, I've mentioned before on the
yep.
show, but my greatest find was a postcard of a postcard factory. I just thought that was the best, you know, very meta, like like
Heavily
this is where
meta.
this was made. Like, if you look closely, you can see this one coming off
Awesome.
the line. I can't thank you enough for taking the time with me today,
That's right.
and you know, doing this. And obviously, you know, at the beginning of the show we talked about your Instagram. What is kind of your, you know, as
Yep.
people want to follow you on there as a retrologist, do you have like
Yeah. So basically,
what's on the
the,
horizon?
the
What do you see coming
brand I
up
use
next?
is Retrologist, but yeah, well, I think basically doubling to continuing to work on the Instagram. I've got a new newsletter through Substack, and I'm trying to grow that. It is a subscription newsletter, and there's a paid component. So if people want to support me and get additional services from me, you know, you can do that as well. I'm tinkering with the idea of a book. Hopefully that comes along, and it would be great if at some point this could branch into some kind of a video series or some kind of a television series. Who knows? I mean,
Mm.
but I think there's certainly potential there for something that's even more robust than what I'm doing right now, which seems hard to conceive of because this is already taking so much time and effort.
Right.
But I'm super thrilled and excited about it, and you know, and again, as long as I'm this passionate about it, I'm going to make sure that it keeps growing and that I keep giving people the kind of content that they're looking for, that they seem to enjoy so much.
I think it's all about, and you were mentioning earlier about Burger King. They've changed a lot of their signage back to the 80s Burger King appearance. And I think that
Very smart.
is exactly why people love your site so much, is because it's on Instagram. You can't get much more cutting edge than Instagram, but it's like one foot in the nostalgia
Right.
and another foot in the future. So it's like a perfect combination. And Rolando Pujol, I can't thank you enough for being on the EPS podcast, where everything, including Holiday Inn and Howard Johnson's, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time, everybody.
Absolutely.
Instagram exists for people like the Retrologist, Rolando Pujol. His constant chronicling of what is staying put and what is leaving the American roadside is what I love about the app, and if you are one of the 96,000 people who follow him, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Beautiful images with interesting news and information of 20th century commercial buildings and signage are regularly posted by the Retrologist, brightening up and enriching the internet each time. I can only hope to make half the positive impact on roadside interpretation and preservation as Rolando, but I will say that I gained many listeners as a result of the collaboration, and through this episode I was put in touch with Jeremy Ebersol and the Society for Commercial Archaeology. These have proved to be wonderful connections and resulted in some excellent everything as a primary source conversations. You can find Rolando on Instagram as the Retrologist, and I'm at the_EPS_podcast. Follow me there on Facebook, YouTube, Patreon, and Substack. Until next time, this is the EPS podcast, where everything, including Hojo's and Holiday Inn, is, once again, a primary source.